My name is Eleanor Grace Whitfield, and I want to tell you about the 90 days that taught me more about myself than the previous 62 years combined. Not because those years were empty. They were full, genuinely full, of a life I had chosen, and a marriage I had believed in, and children I had raised, and a home I had built room by room over 4 decades. But there is a particular kind of knowing that only arrives when everything you assumed was solid turns out to be built on ground you never actually examined. And that kind of knowing, when it comes fast and hard and without mercy, and what you do with it in the weeks that follow determines, more than anything else, who you turn out to be. Edward Whitfield died on a Thursday morning in October, 2 weeks after his 66th birthday, of a second heart attack that came 6 months after the first. The first heart attack had frightened all of us. Me, our 2 children, Edward himself, or so I thought. He had come home from the hospital with instructions from his cardiologist and a changed expression that I interpreted as a man who had looked at mortality and decided to take better care of himself. He started walking in the evenings. He ate less red meat. He took his medications. I watched him with the particular anxious attention of a spouse who has been told the danger is real and who measures every behavior for signs of improvement or decline. He seemed, in those 6 months between the first heart attack and the second, to be genuinely trying. What I did not know, what I could not have known without looking in places I had not thought to look, was what he was doing when I was not watching. Edward handled our finances. He had always handled our finances. This was not an arrangement I had been forced into. It had begun as a practical division of labor in the early years of our marriage, when he was an accountant and I was a middle school English teacher, and it made sense for the person who worked with numbers professionally to manage the household numbers as well. And it had simply continued, year after year, becoming part of the architecture of our life together without either of us examining whether the architecture still made sense. I paid attention to what we spent. I knew roughly what we had. I reviewed the credit card statements when they arrived, and I knew the mortgage payment and the approximate balance in our checking account. But the deeper structure, the investments, the retirement accounts, the full picture of what we owned and what we owed, I had left to Edward. Because Edward knew. Because Edward was competent and careful and had managed money professionally for 35 years. Because I trusted him. He died on a Thursday and I buried him on a Monday, and on the following Thursday, 1 week after his death, the first phone call came. I was sitting in the kitchen with a cup of tea that had gone cold, because everything in those first days went cold before I got around to it, when the phone rang and a voice on the other end said it was calling from a collections department regarding an outstanding balance on an account in Edward Whitfield's name. I said there must be a mistake. I said my husband had just died. The voice expressed condolences and said the account balance was $47,312. I sat down. I was already sitting down, but the sitting became a different kind of sitting, the kind where you are no longer choosing it. I said, "What account?" The voice read me an account number I did not recognize, attached to a line of credit I had not known existed, opened 4 years earlier. I wrote down the information on the notepad I kept by the phone, the one with the sunflower border that I had bought at a dollar store 3 years ago, and that still had most of its pages because I had never written much down. I wrote very carefully, as if the precision of my handwriting could hold something steady in what was becoming an extremely unsteady situation. I called my son, Brian, as soon as I hung up. Brian was 38 years old, lived in Denver with his wife and 2 children, worked in software development, and had what I can only describe as an allergy to difficult conversations. He was a good son in the ways that are easy. He called on birthdays. He came for Christmas. He was warm and affectionate and easy to be around when everything was fine. He was not, I was about to learn, the person you wanted beside you when everything was not fine. I told him about the phone call. I told him the amount. There was a silence on his end that lasted long enough that I said, "Brian, are you there?" He said, "Mom, are you sure you heard it right?" I said I was sure. Another silence. He said, "Okay, well, that is, we should probably look into it. I can try to come out in a few weeks after things settle down a little at work." A few weeks. After things settle down. I thanked him and hung up and sat with the notepad and the sunflower border, and I understood something about the weeks ahead that I had not understood before. My daughter, Sandra, was 35, lived 40 minutes away in Naperville, and was in many ways the more practical of my two children. She was a project manager at a healthcare company, organized and decisive at work, and I had always thought of her as the one I could count on when counting on someone mattered. I called her next. She came over that same evening and sat across from me at the kitchen table and listened to the whole story, and when I finished, she said, "Dad had a secret credit line." And I said yes. And she said, "How much?" And I told her. And she said, "Mom, we need to go through everything, all of his files, his accounts, everything." I said yes, that was exactly what I thought. She said, "I can help you this weekend." This weekend was 4 days away. I said thank you. She left at 8 o'clock because she had an early morning meeting. I did not wait for the weekend. I could not wait for the weekend. I went to Edward's office that night, the small room at the back of the house that had always been his, that smelled of him still in a way that made my chest hurt, that had a desk and a filing cabinet and a shelf of professional books, and a computer that I did not know the password to, and I started going through things. I want to tell you what I found over the course of that night and the following 2 nights, because the finding matters. Not just the facts of it, but the experience of finding, of opening drawer after drawer in the home of a man you loved for 39 years and discovering that the map you had of that home was incomplete, that there were rooms you had not been shown, that you had been living in a house whose full floor plan you did not know. The $47,000 line of credit was not the only debt. There was a second line of credit, opened 3 years ago, with a balance of $31,000. There were 2 credit cards I had not known about, one with a balance of $18,400, one with a balance of $11,200. There was a personal loan from a bank in the amount of $22,000, taken out 18 months earlier. And there was something that took me 2 full evenings to fully understand. A second mortgage on our house, taken out 5 years ago, for $90,000, of which approximately $68,000 remained outstanding. The total, when I added it all on the notepad with the sunflower border, was $196,900. I sat at Edward's desk at 2 in the morning on the 3rd night, and I looked at that number, and I thought about the man who had sat in this chair, at this desk, with these files, for 39 years. I thought about the man who had walked with me in the evenings after his first heart attack. I thought about what he had been walking away from, what weight he had been carrying that he had not put down by coming to me, that he had carried until the second heart attack took him and left it for me instead. I did not feel anger that night. I want to be honest about that. I expected to feel anger, expected it the way you expect rain when the sky turns dark, but what came instead was something more complicated. A grief that was different from the grief I had been feeling all week, deeper and stranger, and with a different texture. I was grieving Edward. And now I was also grieving the Edward I had believed in, which was not exactly the same person, and the distance between those 2 things was a space I did not know how to cross. I went to bed at 3 in the morning. I did not sleep much. I lay in the dark and I thought, I am 62 years old. I have approximately $340,000 in a joint savings account that I now know how to access. I have our house, which was worth approximately $420,000 before I knew about the second mortgage, and which is now worth that minus $68,000 in outstanding debt on a mortgage Edward had taken without my knowledge. I have my teacher's pension, which pays me $3,100 a month. I have Social Security, which I have not yet claimed. And I have just under $200,000 in debt that has arrived in my life like a storm that someone else started and walked away from. What I did not have was a map. What I did not have was anyone who had been in this exact place before and could tell me which way to walk. What I had was the notepad with the sunflower border and the precise handwriting I had maintained throughout that first terrible night of accounting, and the particular stubbornness of a woman who had taught 8th grade English for 31 years and was therefore not unfamiliar with situations that required patience, order, and the willingness to start from the beginning. Sandra came on Saturday as promised. She sat at the kitchen table and I showed her the notepad and I watched her face go through several things in rapid succession. Disbelief, then the particular controlled expression of a project manager encountering a problem larger than she had anticipated, then something quieter and harder to name. She said, "Mom, did you know about any of this?" I said, "No," she said. Not the second mortgage either, I said. Not the second mortgage either. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Okay, we need a plan." We spent 4 hours that Saturday making a list of what needed to happen. The list included contacting a probate attorney, opening a separate account in my name alone, getting copies of all the debt accounts, understanding what was secured versus unsecured, figuring out which debts were joint and which were Edward's alone, and identifying what assets we actually had to work with. It was a solid list. It made me feel, for the first time in a week, that there was a path through this even if I could not yet see where it led. Sandra left at 4 o'clock. She said she would make some calls Monday and look into probate attorneys. She also said, and I am including this because it matters to the story, "Mom, I think you should probably consider selling the house. With the second mortgage and these other debts, it might be the cleanest solution." I said I would think about it. She drove back to Naperville. I stood at the kitchen window and watched her car go, and then I looked at the house around me. At the kitchen I had chosen every appliance in, at the garden visible through the window that I had been tending for 22 years, at the doorframe where I had marked the heights of Brian and Sandra every year until they left for college, the pencil marks still there under 3 coats of paint, still legible if you looked at the right angle in the right light. I was not selling the house. I decided that on Saturday evening. Not dramatically, not with a declaration to anyone. Just quietly in the kitchen with the last of the daylight coming through the window. I was not selling the house. The house was mine, had been mine as much as Edward's for 39 years, and whatever he had done with the financial infrastructure of our life, he had not managed to do it to the house itself, which still stood and was still worth more than what was owed on it. I was going to keep it. And I was going to figure out how. On Monday morning, 8 days after Edward died, I drove myself to the office of an attorney named Margaret Ellison, whose name I had found in a bar association directory under elder law and estate planning. Margaret was in her late 50s, with short silver hair and reading glasses on a beaded chain, and an office that was organized with the precision of someone who believed that clear space produced clear thinking. I sat across from her desk, and I put the notepad with the sunflower border on the surface between us and I told her everything. Margaret listened without interrupting. When I finished, she looked at the notepad for a moment and then looked at me. She said, "Mrs. Whitfield, I want to tell you first that this situation, while very difficult, is not insurmountable. And second, that the most important thing you can do right now is understand exactly what you are and are not legally responsible for." She walked me through the distinction between joint debt and sole debt. The credit cards and the credit lines, she explained, were in Edward's name alone. I had not co-signed, my name did not appear on the accounts, and under Illinois law I was not personally liable for those debts. They would be claims against his estate, which meant against whatever assets were in his name, but they could not come after my personal assets or my share of our jointly held property. The second mortgage was different. My name was on it. I had signed the documents. "I didn't know I signed documents for a second mortgage," I said. Margaret was quiet for a moment. She said, "Do you remember signing anything about 5 years ago related to the house? Refinancing or a home equity line?" I thought. And then, with a cold clarity that was one of the worst feelings of that entire month, I remembered. A Saturday afternoon, Edward with papers at the kitchen table, something about updating the home equity line, nothing to worry about, just a routine update, just needed my signature here and here. I had signed. I had not read closely. I had trusted him. I told Margaret. She nodded with the expression of a person who has heard this before. "The second mortgage is a joint obligation," she said carefully. "That means you are responsible for it. The good news is that you have equity in the house. The house is worth more than the debt, so you are not underwater. The question is how you manage the payment going forward." I asked how much the payment was. She looked at the paperwork I had brought. "Approximately $640 a month," she said. $640 a month. On top of the first mortgage payment, which was $930. On top of utilities and property taxes and insurance, and all the costs of maintaining a 4-bedroom house as a woman living alone on a pension, and what remained of a savings account that had just become significantly more important than I had previously understood. I did the math in my head on the drive home. Pension, $3,100 a month. Social Security, I had not yet claimed, but at 62 I could take a reduced benefit, approximately $1,400 a month, or wait until 67 for the full benefit of approximately $2,200. Savings, $340,000, which needed to last me potentially 30 more years, and which I could not spend indiscriminately. Mortgage 1, $930. Mortgage 2, $640. Property tax, monthly equivalent, approximately $600. Utilities and insurance, approximately $400. Groceries and basic living, $400. That was $2,770 a month in fixed and essential expenses before I bought a book or had lunch with a friend or put gas in the car, against $3,100 in pension income, a margin of $330 per month. I could not live on a margin of $330 a month. I called Sandra from the driveway because I did not want to go inside and cry in the house. She answered on the third ring. I told her what Margaret had said. I told her the monthly math. She said, "Mom, this is exactly why I said you should think about selling the house." I said, "I'm not selling the house." A pause. "Mom, I understand it means a lot to you, but from a purely practical point of view." "Sandra," I said, "I am not selling the house. What I am going to do is figure out how to keep it. And I need you to help me think about that, not argue me toward a solution you have already decided on." Another pause. Then, "Okay, what are you thinking?" I said I did not know yet. I said I would call her when I did. I went inside. I made tea. I sat at the kitchen table, which was where I was doing most of my thinking in those days, and I took out a fresh piece of paper and I wrote at the top, "Resources." And then I started writing down things I had not thought to write down before, because I had been focused on the debts and not the assets, focused on the problem and not the tools. My house had 4 bedrooms. I was one person. 3 of those bedrooms were empty. I had 31 years of teaching experience and a master's degree in English education and a reputation, built over those 3 decades, as one of the better teachers in the Naperville School District. I had time. Something I had taken for granted as a retired person, but I was beginning to understand, a genuinely significant resource if deployed correctly. I had a brain that worked. A problem-solving brain, trained by 31 years of managing classrooms and grading papers, and mediating the interpersonal dramas of 800 eighth graders over a career, and designed, apparently, to function under pressure better than I had previously tested. I looked at the list, and I thought, what do I do with these? The tutoring came first. I called the learning center 3 miles from my house on Wednesday, the one I had driven past for years without ever stopping. I told the director I was a retired English teacher with 31 years of experience and a master's degree, and that I was looking for part-time work. She asked me to come in the following day. I came in. She offered me $28 an hour for up to 20 hours a week, working with middle and high school students on reading, writing, and test preparation. I said yes before she finished the sentence. The room rental took more courage. I had been thinking about it for 3 days before I did it, turning it over in my mind, examining it from angles that were practical and angles that were emotional, because the emotional angle was real. This was my house, and the idea of a stranger in it was uncomfortable in ways I had to consciously decide to move past. What I landed on, after those 3 days of turning it over, was this. The house had been built for a family of 4 and now held 1 person. I had 3 empty bedrooms and a shared kitchen and a living room that no one was using. The house was not diminished by being shared. It was being used, which was what houses were for. I posted on 2 platforms, a local neighborhood group and a university rental board, because the college half a mile from my house was a source of graduate students who needed quiet, stable, month-to-month housing. My ad was specific: furnished room, private bath, shared kitchen and common areas, utilities included, no pets, no smoking, references required. I priced it at $950 a month, which my research told me was fair for the neighborhood. Within 4 days, I had 11 inquiries. I responded to all of them. I interviewed 6 people by phone and 3 in person. I rented to 2. A graduate student in library science named Priya, who was 26 and quiet, and had references from 2 previous landlords that I called and who both said she was exemplary, and a nurse named Ruth, 44 years old, who worked night shifts at the hospital nearby and needed a safe, clean place to sleep during the day, and who had a quality about her that I recognized from 31 years of reading people, the quality of someone who keeps her word. Priya and Ruth moved in on different days in the second month after Edward died. I will not pretend the adjustment was seamless. I will not pretend it was not strange to hear other footsteps in the house in the morning, to find a coffee cup in the drying rack that was not mine, to navigate the small negotiations of shared space with people who were not family. It was strange. It was also, I discovered, not entirely unwelcome. The house had been very quiet since Edward died. The particular quiet of a house that is missing someone is different from the quiet of a house that is simply at rest, and the difference is not peaceful. Priya's occasional music through the wall at 11 in the evening, and Ruth's morning routine before her night shifts, and the simply human sound of other people present in the space. It was not what I had had before, but it was not nothing. The income from the 2 rooms was $1,900 a month. Added to my pension, it brought my monthly income to $5,000 before Social Security. The monthly obligations were $2,770. My margin was now not $330, but over $2,000. $2,000 a month that I could apply to the unsecured debts in Edward's estate, or save, or both. Brian called in the middle of the second month. He had not been in touch much in the weeks since our initial conversation. A text here, a check-in there, the low-intensity presence of someone who has decided the crisis does not require him. When he called and I told him what I had done, the tutoring and the rooms, he was quiet in the way that told me he had not expected this. He said, "Mom, you have strangers living in your house." I said, "I have tenants, 2 of them. They are both excellent." He said, "Are you sure that's safe?" I said, "Brian, I vetted them more carefully than I have vetted most decisions in my recent life, and yes, I am sure." Another silence. Then, "Well, if you are sure, it just seems like a lot of change at once." I thought about what to say to that. What I said was, "Yes, it is. But the change started when your father died and left me with nearly $200,000 in debt I did not know about, so I am managing the change that arrived, not the change I would have preferred." He did not say much after that. He said he was sorry. I believe he meant it. Sandra was more useful than Brian, though in her own circumscribed way. She helped me find a probate attorney to handle Edward's estate, a woman named Carol Nims who was competent and direct, and who walked me through the process of what would happen with the unsecured debts. The creditors would file claims against the estate. The estate had assets. Edward's retirement account, which I was the beneficiary of, and which was therefore mine regardless of the creditors, was separate and protected. The remaining estate assets were modest. The creditors would receive what the estate had to give and would have no claim on my personal assets or the jointly held house. This was better news than I had feared. The second mortgage I had to manage. The rest of it would be handled through the estate process. My exposure was limited to the second mortgage and whatever I chose to do to stay afloat, which I was handling. I want to tell you about the day I fully understood that I was going to be all right. It was in the 3rd month, a Tuesday afternoon in January, cold and gray in the particular flat way of an Illinois winter. I had come home from the learning center after 3 hours of tutoring, a 10th grader who was struggling with analytical writing, a 7th grader working on reading comprehension, a high school junior preparing for the SAT, and I made myself soup and sat at the kitchen table and took out my notebook. Not the sunflower one. A new one, plain blue, that I had bought at the beginning of the 2nd month when I realized I needed more pages. I looked at the numbers. Income, pension $3,100, tutoring roughly $1,800 at 20 hours a week, room rental $1,900. Total, $6,800 a month. Expenses, first mortgage $930, second mortgage $640, property tax $600, utilities and insurance $400, groceries and living $400, incidentals $200. Total, $3,170. Monthly surplus, $3,630. $3,630 every month to either save or apply to the estate obligations or both. I sat with that number and I thought about what it meant. It meant I was not drowning. It meant I was, in fact, more financially stable than I had been in the months before Edward died, when I had assumed we were fine without doing the math, without knowing what fine actually looked like underneath the surface. It meant that the crisis, as terrible as it was, had forced me to understand my own situation with a clarity I had not previously had. And that clarity, however it had arrived, was mine now. I was not going to give it back. I called my friend Helen that evening. Helen Marston had been my closest friend since we had taught together at the same middle school in the 90s, and she was one of the people who had been present and genuinely useful in the aftermath of Edward's death, the kind of friend who shows up without being asked and does practical things without making them feel like charity. I told her about the numbers. I told her about Priya and Ruth. I told her about the tutoring. She listened, and when I was finished, she said, "Eleanor, you did all of this yourself." I said, "I had help from Margaret and Carol." She said, "I mean the plan, the room rentals, the tutoring, the math, you figured all of that out yourself." I said, "Well, I had to." She said, "A lot of people would not have, a lot of people would have sold the house." I thought about Sandra, about the gentle but persistent pressure of those first weeks. I said, "I know," Helen said. "I am proud of you." It was a simple sentence, and it hit me in a way I had not expected, because I realized that I was proud of me too. For the first time in a very long time, I was proud of myself in a way that had nothing to do with anyone else. The 90 days ended on a Thursday in January, exactly 3 months after Edward died on a Thursday in October. I do not put great stock in symmetry, but I noticed it. I noticed it standing at the kitchen window in the early morning with my coffee, looking at the garden that was dormant under a thin layer of snow, the same garden I had been tending for 22 years, the one I had refused to give up along with the house. In 90 days, I had established my own financial accounts and full understanding of my financial situation. I had secured 2 tenants whose combined rent covered my second mortgage and much of my other fixed costs. I had taken on 20 hours a week of tutoring work that I was, to my surprise, genuinely enjoying. I had navigated the probate process with the help of a competent attorney. I had understood the full scope of what Edward had left and what it meant. And I had arrived at a position that was not merely survivable but stable, and not merely stable, but, in a way I had not anticipated, mine in a way that nothing in the previous 39 years had quite been. I want to say something about Edward, because this story is about him too, even though he is not in it after the first paragraphs. I have had 3 months to think about what he did and why, and I have arrived at an understanding that is not comfortable but that I believe is honest. Edward was a proud man. He was a man who identified deeply with his competence, with his role as the person who managed things, who handled the finances, who made sure everything worked. And at some point, I do not know exactly when, I have some guesses from the dates on the accounts, something had gone wrong that he had been unable to tell me about. A bad investment, a period of income instability, something I may never fully know, and rather than come to me, rather than say the words that would have required him to be seen as less than the competent manager he had always been, he had papered over it. With credit. With lines he could manage from his desk in the back room. With the assumption, perhaps, that he would fix it before it became my problem. He ran out of time to fix it, and it became my problem. I am angry about this. I want to be honest that I am angry. The anger has arrived in the 3rd month in a way it did not in the first, which I think is how grief works. The shock comes first, and then the practical crisis, and then, once you have handled the practical crisis, the feeling that you were supposed to feel all along. I am angry that he did not tell me. I am angry that he did not trust me, or that he trusted his own ability to manage the situation more than he trusted the 2 of us together to manage it. I am angry that 39 years of partnership turned out to have a compartment in it that I was not given access to. I am angry on behalf of the woman I was in October, who had buried her husband, and then had to sit alone in his office at 2 in the morning and discover, drawer by drawer, how much she had not been told. And I am also, at the same time, still in love with the man who walked with me in the evenings, who made me laugh for 39 years, who sat in this kitchen with me through every season of our life, and who, whatever else he was keeping, was also genuinely, demonstrably present. Both things are true, the anger and the love, the betrayal and the grief. I am learning to hold them at the same time without requiring one to erase the other, because neither one will, and demanding that they do is a demand neither my heart nor the facts will satisfy. What I have now, 3 months after the worst Thursday of my life, is this: a house that is mine, in every sense of the word, for the first time. A financial life I understand completely, in every account and every obligation and every asset, because I built this version of it myself, and there are no drawers I have not opened. A part-time career that uses the skills I spent 31 years developing, and that pays me reasonably, and that gets me out of the house and into the company of young people who are struggling with something, and who I know how to help. 2 tenants who are good people, and who have made the house feel occupied in a way that is not what I wanted, but that is, most mornings, all right. A best friend who calls every week. An attorney who answers my questions without condescension. A new notebook with more pages than I will probably need, in which I am writing the actual shape of my actual life, finally, at 62. Brian is coming in the spring. He said so last week, a real commitment with a date attached, a long weekend in April when his kids have school vacation. I told him I was glad. I meant it. Sandra comes for dinner most Sundays now. This started in the 2nd month, her own idea without being asked, and it has become a thing I look forward to in the way you look forward to things that are simply good. She does not mention selling the house anymore. I think she understands that the house was never really the question. The question was whether I could stand on my own. The question was what I was made of when the thing I had been leaning on was no longer there. The question was whether 62 was old or just the age at which certain things become finally and fully clear. I know the answer now. I could not have told you in October, standing at the kitchen window waiting for a phone call from a son who would not come for months. I could not have told you in November, sitting in Margaret Ellison's office with a notepad full of numbers I had never wanted to know. I can tell you now, in January, with the garden under snow and coffee in my hand, and a house that hums with the quiet presence of people I chose, and work I chose, and a life I am building for myself from whatever Edward left, and whatever I have found in myself that I did not know was there. I am Eleanor Grace Whitfield. I am 62 years old. I am not the woman my husband left when he died because that woman did not know what she was capable of. I am the woman who found out. That is the whole of it. That is 90 days. That is everything.